The Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has reached an agreement with his Foreign Minister, Yair Lapid, as negotiations to save the shaky coalition government hit deadlock. That means Israel will head to the polls for a fifth election in a little over 3 years. News that many Israelis have been expecting, but it is now official. They will be voting once again in another election. As part of the agreement, Yair Lapid will take over as Prime Minister. He'll be in the top job until a new government is formed. And we know that that may take some time, whether or not the election takes place sooner rather than later. We don't know when the election will happen. And as I say, this has been a long time coming. The coalition of Bennett's right-wing Yamina party, the Arab parties under Mansour Abbas, the New Hope party, Labour, Meretz, the left-wing parties have hit many disputes, and it seems that the coalition is no longer tenable. Well, we'll be speaking about that throughout the programme, but as I say, this is breaking news. This is literally just happened in the last few moments. Our senior international affairs editor, Owen Alterman, is here with me in the studio. And Owen, as I say, everybody was expecting this, weren't they? But they perhaps weren't expecting it to happen quite so soon.
Well, and they weren't expecting it to happen the way it happened. Laura, I've been saying on our air over and over again the last 2 weeks that it had been a consensus here in Israel that this coalition was going to fall. But the two things that were unknown were when and by whom. And the by whom, of course, here, the most surprising, it's not by any of the individual actors from within the coalition, right, those rebels. It's not from some initiative from the opposition. It's by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, particularly Bennett, falling on his own sword. Essentially, they themselves pulling the rug from out from under the rebels, saying, you have no leverage over us because we ourselves are going to fall on our own sword. We ourselves are going to dissolve the parliament. We ourselves are going to be moving forward with this rotation, and we ourselves are going to be dictating the terms of when, and we ourselves are going to be dictating the terms of who. And Laura, you just made an extremely important point in our lead that we've also been talking about the last few weeks. Yair Lapid will now become interim prime minister again. This is the way the coalition agreement had been designed to work, right? That if members of the right-wing flank within the coalition were those who essentially led to the coalition falling, then it would be Lapid who led the center-left bloc. The other part of this coalition would become prime minister, the idea being that that would give each side an incentive to keep his or her own troops on board. But what that means is that Lapid will be interim prime minister, and again, importantly, Laura, he's not only prime minister until elections are held. He's prime minister until a new government is formed. And what we've learned, if we've learned nothing else about Israeli politics the last few years, it's not so simple to form a government in this country. And it could take more than one election cycle. And in principle, Lapid could be interim prime minister for an extended period of time. So a very, very important move, not just for the inner workings of Israeli politics, but for Israeli foreign policy, for the way the country is seen abroad, for who represents it abroad, for the Middle East. Of course, this is Middle East now, for the Middle East and for Israel's relations in the Middle East. So in a very, very important event in Israel and in the halls of the Israeli parliament that will, of course, have ripple effects outward.
And so what happened then, Owen? Because this was a coalition government with a razor-thin majority already, very disparate parties with very different ideologies. Some analysts say they came together as a kind of anti-Netanyahu bloc against the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Was there one issue that brought them down, or was there the actions of one member of this government that brought them down? What would you put it down to?
No, I think, Laura, the surprise is not that the coalition is falling. The surprise is that it stayed together for so long. The surprise is that it came into being in the first place, right? Again, a coalition that includes, as its prime minister, a former chairman of the settlement council, of the settlement movement, right? The head of the settlement movement serving in the same governing coalition as a party with at least loose affiliations with the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And the full Israeli political spectrum in between.
Ram, the Islamist
exactly, the Islamist party Ram. And the full political spectrum in between, that this group came together in the first place is something that happened against the political odds. The fact that they stayed together and worked together reasonably harmoniously, given the circumstances, for 10, 11 months is also something that was not expected, that was very much a man biting a dog in Israeli politics and democratic politics worldwide. This has been a political experience, Laura, that had been watched and looked at closely from beyond Israel's borders. because of the curiosity and because of what it said about the nature of politics in the 21st century, where so many countries are suffering from polarization. And so the idea that it ultimately fell apart is not something that should be a surprise to any of us. The fact that it took 10, 11, 12 months for it to fall apart, that I think is the surprise.
All right, Owen, for now, thank you very much indeed. Well, we're joined now on the line by Gil Hoffman, the chief political correspondent and analyst at the Jerusalem Post. Thank you very much indeed. We appreciate it, Gil. So your reaction then to this news, is this a huge surprise for you?
I was definitely taken by surprise that they decided to do it so quickly. It's not so often that politicians fall on their sword. I was told by people who'd spoken with Nir Orbach that he wasn't going to bring down the government this week anyway. They could have kept on fighting for another week, but I totally understand why they wanted to leave on their terms and not be ousted by Netanyahu and the opposition that has treated them so badly, not recognized their leadership, not even permitted committees to function in the Knesset because they didn't want to recognize their leadership. So they did it their way.
Well, was this coalition just too disparate in the end? Were they ideologically too many differences on how to do things and how to move the country forward?
No, this government could have worked. Even though it is the most diverse government in the history of Israel, possibly the most diverse government in the history of mankind on this earth, it could have worked. They just needed a few more seats. 61's hard for anyone, even if you have an ideologically homogenous right-wing government. It still wouldn't function very well with 61, which Netanyahu had for a while. Now, when you have 61 who all were pulling in different directions, that made it harder. But if they would have had another few members of Knesset, even if you've got right-wing, centrist, left-wing, and Arab members of Knesset together, it could have worked. This is not something that proves that diversity cannot work.
And we are hearing that the election may well take place at the end of October. That's unconfirmed, but that's just some information in Israeli media right now. Gil, one person who will possibly be celebrating tonight is, of course, the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Will he be staging his comeback already, do you think?
Well, the opposition leaders are meeting right now to talk about how to coordinate their strategy. But absolutely, Netanyahu, I went to his faction meeting today, and he was very energized, calling this the worst government in the history of Israel. He is only 71 years old. His father died at the age of 102. He's not going anywhere.